Hello. All right, so we have five people. I'm grateful for the five of you. What we're working on this week, right, is the civil rights movement, the civil rights movement argumentative assignment. So what I want to do is I want to get your names down, and then from there, I want to jump right into this this assignment and this topic. Okay, what a big topic, right? So I'm going to mostly adhere to the handout because I'm not an expert on this, and I could go, but at the same time I could go a long time, and I don't want to for your sake as well as for mine. So let's see here. We're doing the civil rights movement. So first of all, are there any questions? Okay. Well, getting into the civil rights movement, right? We're looking at a couple topics or a couple areas of discourse in particular. One, right, is causation. What really brought about the civil rights movement? How did it achieve the success that it did? And secondly, right, we're looking at pardon here, I'm terrible at multitasking. Make sure I have, okay, good. I have all five of your names. Um, so at any rate, with causation, with efficacy, what is effective, what problems were sufficiently addressed or mitigated or eradicated, rectified, etc. So at any rate, looking at this, right, most of the time, historians will look at World War II in particular as a influential event, time period that likely had an influence on the civil rights movement happening when it did. I mean, after all, right, at the very beginning of the semester, you saw how Reconstruction failed to provide full political equality, right? Much less social equality for certain demographics, and we focused a lot on African Americans, as we will again today. And so remember, like with the 14th Amendment, you were to enjoy all the rights, the privileges, the protections, right, of citizenship, because I think that's helpful, even that being sounding vaguely, right. When you look at Rome, when you look at Dutch New Netherlands, and many other instances, there have historically been levels of citizenship, right, so that you're first of all, right, like looking at U.S. history, they talked about giving basic economic rights first to African Americans, right, whereby they were to enjoy the right to engage in the capitalist system, to rent, to buy, to sell, right, to borrow, to own property, and to protect that, have that property protected under a court of law, etc. So basic economic rights, and some moderates at the time of the Civil War wanted only that. Said, okay, well, at least let's just start there, right? Then you have, right, the full protection of the Bill of Rights and everything that comes with it, right? And oftentimes, many of the groups like the abolitionists and others, they were largely in unison in wanting that as well, right? So to have their basic rights protected under the law. But then you get into political participation. Should they be able to vote? Should they be able to run for office? Right. And that was seen as being much more radical at the time of Reconstruction at the end of the Civil War. Right. So that's a whole other realm. And then, of course, you get to the point, and another one that was really, as long with those legal participatory rights, is you look at the right to serve on a jury. The White South put up a big fight against that movement, right? There was the fear, right, that because juries have to decide unanimously on decisions, they were afraid that even one black man or woman in a jury would exonerate and keep the jury from rightfully convicting, right, a black suspect who, of course, hypothetically in their minds, is guilty, and that one person would get him or her off, right? And so there was a big backlash against that movement. And then, of course, you have social and just, complete integration, whereby they're allowed into all the institutions that a society has to offer, church, public schools, private schools for that matter, and also families, right? My goodness, it has been such a long held tradition in the South in particular, this Anglo fear of miscegenation, right? Of interethnic sex and marriage and procreation. And so there are lots of different levels here, right? That can be addressed. So in World War II, to what extent did the circumstances deliberately, or in many cases inadvertently or indirectly, raise the expectations of African Americans and empower them? All right. So you have a section just on that. So look at some of the data, if you would, that's utilized by the writer to try to defend this claim, right? And linking World War II to the subsequent generations' push for civil rights. So, I mean, for one, right, is the rhetoric of World War II, like with the Atlantic Charter, right, contended that the Allies were fighting for human rights. Amongst them, right, the freedom from economic want and the freedom of individual dignity, right? Well, how ironic in light of how we were segregating Black troops and how we were arguably throwing minority groups into dangerous battles, particularly in Italy. How we were treating Mexican Americans in light of, like, with certain kind of symbolic occurrences, like the Sleepy Lagoon case and the Zoot Suit riots, the internment of at least 110,000 Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans, right? And remember, Korematsu and a couple other Japanese Americans sued in court, saying, according to the 14th Amendment, by being born here, they were U.S. citizens. And the Supreme Court sided with the military establishment and allowed them to momentarily be deprived of their civil rights during this emergency period. And so the point being, right, is here we are giving forth this rhetoric that we're fighting for human rights and dignity of all people and so forth. And so the hypocrisy of it became more glaring, right? So you think of it at the micro level with an abusive parent or something, right? And it's bad enough for the parent to be such in his or her behavior, but then it takes on a whole other level of indignation, perhaps, that it elicits within the child when the parent, publicly puts on a facade of being the symbol of meekness and gentleness and kindness, etc. Right? So that you see that element in World War II. Okay. Then you also see, right, as you did in World War One, is also just this is a probably rudimentary way of putting it, and I'm not being condescending, it's just the only thing that's coming to my mind at the moment. But seeing the world, right? We saw this, right, with the African Americans who fought under French commanders in World War One, is in seeing the world, right? They got to see as soldiers, right? Because of course, minority groups were drafted just as WASP Americans were drafted, right? In some cases, some people say even more so. So they got to see the world, right? They fought in the Pacific. They got to see the Australians and Guinea or the Philippines, etc., right? Or Dutch Indonesia, and they got to see, in some cases, you could make the argument that they saw things just as bad as what they saw back at home, and they saw it became glaringly apparent that something needs to be done at a global level, and they would start in the U.S. And in some cases, they saw things much better, right? Whereby they said, well, look at this. They seem to be virtually colorblind in this area. They tend to identify people more by their religion, for instance, than they do by the color of their skin here in the Philippines. And so, what's going on back at home. So it broadened their horizon. It gave them a frame of reference, etc. Right? Not to mention, right, is it their their collective self-esteem, right, and fighting for the country, putting on the uniform, putting their life on the line, seeing comrades literally give their lives, right? That this enhanced their expectations, arguably, with individual and mass psychology. You had a gentleman, right, who, in the case of Three Rivers, Texas, Longoria. What was his? See here. Shame on me for not remember. Felix, right? So you had a gentleman named Felix Longoria, right, from Texas, a Mexican American. He was killed in the Philippines, right? So he gave his life for the country, and he comes, his body is brought back home, and they're not even allowed to inter him and have a funeral service because he's Mexican American in Three Rivers, Texas. And it got a lot of publicity, and the GI Forum largely, arose and came to his defense, and a lot of publicity was given to this event. So, like I said, there was a sense of collective self-esteem that was aggrandized by their willingness to go and fight and even die for this country and bleed for the country. So you have those elements as well. Then you also have, of course, the GI Bill, right? And with the GI Bill and the Federal Housing Administration, right, with FHA, it helped with the GI Bill, right? The government, if you have fought as a veteran, the government subsidizes your education and also subsidizes your mortgage, right, acquisition. And so, hence, this helped, right? This helped um, basically minority. I know that's kind of an archaic word, but so excuse me for using it. But it helped minority groups, right, rise socioeconomically. And it's just an historical fact that you have the whole idea of correlation versus causation, right? Something happens, and there's one factor that's involved. Did that factor help cause it, or did it just seem to coincide with it, right? So I understand this is arguable, but I think it's strange to consider it a coincidence. Look back, especially in European history, when a certain demographic arose socioeconomically, right? They rose in how much income they had, the social prestige connected to their job positions, right, and their demographic group. That shortly thereafter, what do you know? They petition or even fight for greater integration, to be allowed to be, given a piece of the pie, if you will, right? Political participation, economic opportunities, social and cultural acceptance, etc. Right? And so it's happened so many times. And what do you know? It happens here, right? For instance, if you look at PBS Chicano movement. There are at least 3 or 4 videos, right? They have them separated by topic. So like fighting, not literally fighting, but the fight, right, in the schools, the fight in the fields, for instance, are separate videos. Very fascinating topic. But when you look, right, so often, and of course there were exceptions, like Cesar Chavez, but many times, like with Jose Angel Gutierrez and others, it was these young men who just came and took over, right? They began collectively going from house to house, having people sign petitions, carrying out conventions and meetings, and with ambitious goals and methods, right? And you look at Jose Angel Gutierrez and people like him, right? They were they had read about Mahatma Gandhi, right, and his civil disobedience against England, right, in India. They had read about Christ and about civil disobedience in particular. They had read all these different cases of decolonization movements, right, of colonized people fighting for their autonomy, their independence, right. And so they're oftentimes, in particular, not just economically doing better, right, enhances your self-esteem, but also the educational levels, right, rose amongst Latinos and African Americans, etc. And what do you know? A lot of the leaders were literally connected to universities and university educated, etc. It broadened their horizons, as academia claims that it still wants to do, right? Academia, for at least the last couple centuries, has claimed to be kind of anti-institutional, countercultural, right? And so you're encouraged to question things, even defy certain institutional leaders and customs and traditions, etc. So that helped, right? That evidently helped empower, right, in many ways, materially and psychologically, uh, these different groups to fight for their rights, right? To stand up for their rights. Not to mention, right, resources. When you look at something like, you know, institutions, right, require not only organization, not only widespread support, but money, right? And so you have teams like, you know, like the NAACP, which was established about 1905, right? AAC, sorry, brain went out. So the NAACP for African Americans, right? The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People under W.E.B. Du Bois and others in Niagara, New York. And they wanted, right, to uh, primarily to fight in the courts. And it takes a lot of resources, right, to really serve as a powerful lobbyist group in the court system, because suits and countersuits and appeals, they all take resources and especially money. And then, of course, you have LULAC amongst the Latin Americans in Texas. What was it? The League of United Latin American Citizens, I believe it was. And so when you look at those organizations, right, they're empowered by these new middle class, college educated um, uh, professionals, right? So all of those arguably can be connected to World War II and be utilized in the argument, which is subjective, by the way. You could argue against it and find this not to be credible, but that World War II was instrumental in bringing about the civil rights movement when it happened, right? Which, of course, arguably really heated up about 1963. Okay, so the Cold War, same thing, right? Is that geopolitical competition with the Soviet Union. So we are trying to gain, right, hypothetical contingency allies, just in case the Soviet Union were to attack us, right? We want allies in the Pacific Islands. We want islands in Latin America, geographically beneath us. We want allies in the Caribbean. Remember, because with geopolitics, you look at the globe as a map or like a chessboard. You deal with the what ifs as far as your possible enemies and threats, and you try to secure help and resources, especially in geographically vital areas where you might be attacked, right? And so, at any rate, we're trying to win over, you know, Catholic, indigenous, and Iberian people that are certainly not WASP in Latin America, for instance, or Polynesians in the Pacific. And so there was, right, a challenge by the Soviet Union contending, right, telling the quote third world countries, telling the D, and by the way, right, to decolonizing nations, quote, of color. Because when you look at Indonesia, Malaysia, you look at Africa, right, especially in Asia and Africa, they're going to experience at the end of World War II a lot of decolonization rebellions, right, to get freedom from the mother country. So we've talked about, you know, England over India, and India putting up a petition to that. The French in North Africa, right, Algeria, Morocco, etc. The Portuguese in Angola, etc., etc. And so, you know, and the UN's going to get involved in this as well. And so the Soviet Union puts out a call and says, don't join the United States, NATO, right? Because look at how they treat their people of color domestically within their own borders. You think they're going to respect you as a nation? And so, you know, it may not be a coincidence that Truman made, albeit kind of minor, but some changes, some improvements within the administration, within his bureaucracy. And by the way, he also desegregated the armed forces, for instance, right after this challenge. So was it, you know, in direct response to that challenge, right? So that the Cold War, like I said, these nations, quote, of color, not only are they going to be a source of inspiration to people like Malcolm X, but they also are going to perhaps um, put pressure upon the United States government to try to put its best foot forward, right, and try to win customers, if you will, right, and trying to win over these Asian and African and other countries by showing goodwill toward minority groups here in the U.S. itself, right. Also, with the Cold War, right, is you have the industrial military complex, the name that Eisenhower coined and made famous. It's the marriage between big business and government, right? In our military buildup, we wanted to be ready, right? Just in case an attack were to come from the Soviet Union. So we created infrastructure with a highway system. We continued to make military technology and so forth, and with big companies that had changed, right, from like trucks to tanks during World War II, many of which continued to make tanks after the war, right, in this military buildup. Because the idea under Eisenhower, later Reagan, et cetera, certain, especially Republican administrations, is that we need to deter um, the Soviet Union. We need to make them, kind of like having a sign saying the owner of this house, has a gun. The owner of this house has a big dog, etc. Right? That you cynically don't believe that you could reason with, right, and have any kind of reconciliation with this possible opponent. So you'd rather just make him scared of attacking you, right? And so the military industrial complex. What am I doing? Those are supposed to be swapped. I'm sorry. It's not that late in the day, and my brain is mush. Sorry about that.
Can I chime in for a minute about Reagan?
Absolutely. Anytime, you guys chime in anytime you want.
Don't you think that, do you agree that Reagan really played like his cards, like he put a lot out there, like a risk taking, but it, in the end, it came across as like, like he called their bluffs a lot in the Cold War, and he really propelled us forward where it could have gone the opposite, but because he was such a good, what do you call that? The way that he was able to negotiate with people and come
Uh-huh.
across in a favorable way, it worked for him, I felt. But it is, do you agree with that? Getting us past the end of that?
I do. I think in the short run, I think his deterrence policy seemed to yield, um, you know, uh, favorable effects on the United States
Mm-hmm.
and keeping us safe, right? Um, Maintaining American, preparedness and maybe even hegemony or domination in many places
Yeah.
of the globe. Uh,
Yeah.
I think that you could definitely support that argument for sure. Of course, in the long run, though, right, it's more argumentative and it's a little
Yeah.
less apparent because we're going to have certain cases with certain countries and so forth. Things
Right. Right.
perhaps arguably kind of bite us in the rear later on.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure.
But yeah, I think that I think especially when you're dealing with a short run, I think his readiness to and not just his readiness, right, but kind of that poker face, right, in
Yes,
some
exactly.
countries
That's what I meant.
afraid that he would, even when he didn't
Yeah.
have to do such, right,
Yeah.
that he kept danger at bay in the short
Mhm.
run, and the degree to which he caused the implosion of the Soviet Union is very disputed, right.
Yeah.
I don't begin to pretend to be an expert in that field and have depth enough of knowledge to
Yeah.
give a definitive argument on that.
Mhm.
But of course, you have to also consider, right, the policies like perestroika and glasnost and others in the Soviet Union and
Mhm.
different problems that they had that were pretty much uh, independent from the United States. But nevertheless, right, I think it's almost indisputable that his encouragement of the arms race, right?
Mhm.
I think in hindsight, it definitely exacerbated the Soviet Union's problems, right? Uh,
Yeah.
Nothing else, just financially, as they began, right, just spending into oblivion, trying to keep up with us,
Yeah. Yeah.
arms race. And
And it,
so,
go
go
ahead.
ahead, Polly.
No,
No,
go
no,
ahead.
please. No, that's it, really. Yeah, that's kind of all I have on that subject right
I
now.
just wanted to jump back real quick, and I felt like when I was doing reading this, because I was a little behind, and I was reading what we were just talking about in part one, if we
Right.
could jump back to that. And you know
Sure.
how you talked about things happening like did they happen because of each other or did they happen just because of coincidence alongside each other?
That's right.
As far as we when we were talking about how like the first question on the test that test we took where it said that excuse me how in the beginning of 1942 in Pearl Harbor how it wasn't going very well for our allies.
Right.
And then I felt like because America was so scared and insecure and like really like worried at that time, it's kind of like the Titanic when everyone turns and looks at each other, and in that moment, color, race, religion, nothing matters. It's like, oh my gosh, we could die, and you're all seeing each other on an even level of
That's right.
you're all in the same place. And I just feel like overall if we didn't have so many Americans that could recognize when we had minorities going to war and fighting alongside white people, white men and women, or white men, that if they couldn't see that, then I don't think we would have gotten as far as we did in that time or got a lot of those people to fight for the minority groups, like, passing the GI Bill or helping, you know, the institutions helping, to support them afterwards. Do you agree?
Absolutely. No, no, I do. I,
Like we
I
would
think
just
there's
be
a lot of
monsters if
validity
we
to that.
didn't. So I felt like at that time it should have really put aside a lot of the prejudice and the problems we're still facing today. But it makes me sad, because
Yes.
that's just the way I see it. You
No,
know.
absolutely. And I think there is a lot of validity to what you just said. Very much so. You look at I think that was a great example was Pearl Harbor, right?
Yeah.
Another one I think of are the problems in the maltreatment of prisoners of war by the Japanese, right? The Bataan Death March in the Philippines, etc. Right?
Hmm.
Those who suffered from that were very ethnically diverse as Americans, and absolutely they long after the war they had a lot of memorial type events,
Hmm.
and you see this evidence of this apparent camaraderie that lasted for their
Yeah.
entire lives.
Yeah, that's a good word
Gone
for
through
it.
a common ordeal.
And I would think that in the pandemic that could have led us forward, but because of the incidents that happened at that same time with George Floyd, it reignited something larger,
Yeah,
a
I think
type
that's
of
a
incident.
very
Oh wait.
yeah, I think that's an intelligent and relevant connection.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, unfortunately. Um, so let's see here with the military industrial complex. So for one, right, we have jobs, right? So I think of, for instance, there is a book called Abiding Courage, and it's about African American women moving into the East Bay, primarily to Oakland and Richmond, to work in the Kaiser shipyards, right? They were paid much better than they had previously been paid. And by the way, with women in particular, right? Female employment arose 60%, Alan Brinkley states in the textbook, during World War II, right? Rosie the Riveter. So at any rate, the women began moving en masse, right, and as a whole, to the East Bay, to Southern California, East Coast places as well, to do jobs that had been vacated by men who had been drafted and sent overseas, and so it empowered minority groups with jobs, right? And then also remember Keynesian economics, that the idea, right, under John Maynard Keynes was that something like the New Deal is healthy for the economy, and that's a liberal perspective. It's certainly not definitively and universally accepted, so please keep that in mind. But some historians contend, right, that the government getting involved in the economy to directly bring about, in particular, right, income for more individuals, right, working in these military contract industries, that provides purchasing power for those individuals, and of course they're going to use that purchasing power at the marketplace, and that's going to help business growth, et cetera, et cetera. So remember, with Keynesian economics, it contends that the health of an economy is largely predicated by the purchasing power of the common people of the country, and that purchasing power can and perhaps at times ought to be stimulated by the government. Okay, so Keynesian economics is certainly not laissez-faire. It's not old school government, let it be, let the economy do its own thing, you know what I mean, go through its own cycles, anything but. So some people praise that component to the military industrial complex. And of course, they don't praise all components to it, right? The fact that we just went over recently or last week with the Cold War and McCarthyism, right? And this kind of the irony of having this kind of almost tyrannical and Salem witch trial like uh, phenomenon and culture with the Red Scare. Um, so definitely you have components to the military industrial complex that have been primarily critiqued. But this facet, at least according to those who adhere to Keynesian economics, has oftentimes been praised, is that it involved um, uh, enrichment of jobs, right? Enlargement of jobs for more individuals, more Americans, more demographics, etc. All right. I think of in particular, right, as well as the that book. I think of African Americans in Detroit working in Ford's companies, etc. All right. So at any rate, you have the military industrial complex that was kind of predicated by the Cold War, and that supposedly provided more purchasing power to more minority groups, amongst others, right? And so for those reasons and more, people will connect the Cold War to the civil rights movement. And and remember also the gross national product, right? The value of all the products created in the U.S. in the 1950s, in the height of the Cold War, arguably, um, they it went up like 250%. Overall purchasing power, income and even purchasing power went up double digits overall per capita during this time. So Americans at large, by and large, were doing better, right, economically, again, tied to that. And also, I'd like to say, and I only know this from one class years and years ago, but also, right, what about Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Has anybody studied that?
Yeah, a little bit.
So, Aaron, I'll tell you what. I'm going to say the basics because there. It basically entails all that which I remember, and I've not read up on this in so long. And if you could, Aaron, you kind of chime in with anything else, anything
I
deep.
don't remember a whole lot of it. I just
Uh-huh.
know I remember studying it at some point. I just don't remember. Like when you said that, I'm like, oh yeah, I've heard that, but I just don't remember a whole lot about it.
No, it's
Is
okay.
that the theory of nurture versus what is it? Nurture
Nature
and
versus nurture.
yes, is that one?
That is, I think, oftentimes tied to it, right? Nature versus nurture, right? Is to what extent, right, can our behavior be dictated by biologically who we are, right? The genes that we inherit, and versus nurture, to what extent does our environment help influence or even dictate how we behave? And in this case, right, I think Maslow's hierarchy of needs adheres to the more to the theory of the influence of nurture, right? And that, like I said, please, I hope I've qualified this well enough. When a history teacher gets into, psychology and philosophy, he or she better be careful, right? So I like to just dabble, just stick my toes into these disciplines.
Psychology's my major, so I got you.
All right, there we go. Perfect. But from what I derive from it, right, is that people, right, we there are different levels of development in human culture, and when people are at a primal state, right, that we subconsciously and consciously we kind of triage, right? We decide what is most urgent and what is down to what is least urgent, right? And so, firstly, we need to take care of our physical needs. We need to make sure that,
Yes,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
that's correct. The psychosocial.
Good. See, there you go. You're already over my head. I don't recall any of those terms, but great. That's wonderful. So at any rate, from what I understand, what I think I remember, is that we first worry about our physical needs, right? Of what basically food and shelter and safety, right? For our loved ones and for us. And then it goes in these steps. And my goodness, of course, I don't recall the steps, much less the names of those categories. But as we become more materially comfortable, right, then we can we could deal with the more I, I I don't think this is the right word because that's one of the end phases, I believe, but more esoteric parts of life, right? I think of the word ontology, right? Like what is the meaning of life? Do you believe in God? Do you believe there's a purpose, etc.,
Yes,
right?
that's the very top. Self-actualization, actually.
Thank you. Self-actualization. Thank you very much, Polly.
And the
Uh,
nurturing is in the middle, just like she said.
Good, good, good. All right. And so basically what I meant to convey, and please, Polly, chime in more. I can't tell you how much I genuinely love this. And this is like the one of the main primary reasons for which I miss teaching in person is to get feedback like this. But what I'm trying to convey, right, at a rudimentary level, the little I remember, is that you're not going to be pondering the meaning of life. You're not going to be wondering, who am I, what's my identity, etc., if you're being chased by a lion or a tiger and it's about to eat you, right? That you first have to have your material conditions taken care of. So now going back to World War II, the Cold War, post-war boom, etc., these Mexican Americans, these African Americans, women are living more comfortably now, right? They're not worried primarily, in many cases, about where the next meal is going to come, about the safety of their children, etc. So
And they have more
now,
self-esteem, too, like you said.
good self-esteem, absolutely. So now they can address things, right? Like, wait a minute, why here I am putting forth all these contributions to society with World War II sacrifices, right? For my country. Uh, I'm reading in college about the lofty rhetoric of the United States from the Enlightenment and classical liberalism about the equality of all people and what every human being is entitled to. And I'm seeing a huge discrepancy in my personal life. And as I look out over, other people, in particular, my own demographic. And so now I have the time, I have the education and the knowledge, I have the resources, I have the self-esteem and the confidence, right? To say, wait a minute, I'm no longer okay with this. I want to do something about it. I wish I could remember the particular case. I could try to find it by next week if you like, but there is a case in which people go to a market environment and they have no idea that they're being utilized as guinea pigs, and they are deliberately right. They're deliberately wronged by this business and this representative, and they try to find a pattern as to regarding those who stand up for their rights, right, and say, oh heck no, I want to talk to your manager. I'm not leaving until this is rectified, right? Versus those who kind of obsequiously say, okay, whatever, and they just take it in the chin and leave without any type of protest and everything in between, right? And they were looking for age to be a determining factor. They were looking for economics, obviously, to be a determining factor, ethnicity, etc. Right? And in this particular case, of which I could not, of course, identify presently, the seeming salient that just kept standing out difference seemed to be an educational attainment. That by and large, those who had, for instance, a college bachelor's degree tended to be more adamant in fighting for their rights and being wronged by this business representative as opposed to the others. But Paulie or anyone else, do you have anything to add to this to enrich with this topic of what I'm not sure how well I'm doing trying to convey?
Well, I think you did a good job. I'm not sure of the test, but because I'm in psychology and marketing, it's funny that you said market. But, they have those same things that you just said, the socio-culture environment and so on, how it
Uh-huh.
affects people. And the demographics, like you said, and their economic and their education were all part of that
Good, good,
text.
good.
I don't know if it's the same one, but they based more research off of it for for the psychology of marketing and whatnot. So it sounds like that's exactly how it went. I agree.
Good, good. I hope so. Anybody else?
It
Yesenia?
sounds like that TV show, What Would You Do?
Uh-huh.
You know what I'm the talk about, where they put these people in the most ridiculous situations and then just to see what they would do in them.
Yeah, and
Oh,
I
yeah,
think
what
it's
would you do? Oh, yeah, to love about people's values and things. Like if they saw somebody getting kidnapped, would they stop and intervene? Or yeah,
Mhm.
or someone being talked to. Sometimes I would be like, oh my god, they're just totally berating this person because of their ethnicity, like right out loud, and see how many people actually stand up for them.
Yeah.
that's right.
That was a good one.
Yeah, that's a good example.
But I think I understand what you're meaning by this.
I hope
Is
so.
it as far as we're still trying to put this with the military industrial complex time,
Yes.
right? Okay.
And I think it's important to remember also, right, that historians also, right, we borrow from sociology and putting society into at least three categories, right? Social, political, and economic. And
Uh-huh.
that we live, right, if to whatever extent that that's true, we live constantly in all three. There's constant inner exchange, right, of
Yeah.
all three. So I think of, for instance, the social realm, right, with culture, psychology, etc., right. And I think about, the fact that, like SNCC, right, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you have people like Beverly Nash, who was not fully African American. At times, she was able to get by as a white person due to the lightness of her skin, and and there she was in Tennessee, finishing her degree in college, right? Bob Moses, an instructor, right? These other people, Stokely Carmichael, they were well educated. They lived arguably. I don't have time to get into this to try to defend it. And not only that, I don't know how much data I have to defend it, so I want to qualify it first. But arguably, it has been said, right, that the degree of institutional racism, right, not just cultural racism, because I can't account for that, but at least the degree to which your life is affected daily by discrimination with laws and realities, etc., right? That you could make the argument that in the upper South in Tennessee, it was not as bad as it was down in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. But for those reasons, what I'm saying is you have people who socially, in the social category of society, perhaps they had reasons to have a higher self-esteem, right? So they go down into the deep South, whether it was like CORE and the Freedom Rides riding down into the South, right? Or and that was like 61, or the Freedom Summer, which I believe was 64, going deep down into the heart of the deep South, all these college students. And by the way, we're not just talking about SNCC members from Tennessee. With CORE, a lot of them were from New York and from the Northeast, right? So they come from a different world where arguably they're not as socially beaten down. And they come with this great self-esteem and courage into the deep South to register people to vote, et cetera, right? And you have primary source evidence written by them, right? In diaries, letters, et cetera, whereby they say how saddened they become when they see how beaten the people in the deep South are, the African Americans, that socially, culturally, right, they were so accustomed to having to show deference, to fearing for their lives, etc., right, that they individually and collectively, they didn't have the hope, they didn't have the self-esteem that was infused into them by these people from the northern states coming down to empower and lead them. And so, I think psychology has a lot to offer history in any topic, but especially the civil rights movement. I think that you could make the argument, at least, that in the social realm, you've got to have some factors that enhance the self-esteem, the confidence, the indignation, right? Like the righteous anger that a certain demographic has to be able to really make the sacrifices and really be confrontational enough to get things done, right? And you might make the argument that socially and culturally, Southerners may not have been able to do it on their own. Now, I don't mean to make that simplistic dichotomy between Northern and Southern African Americans. It obviously wasn't that cut and dry. For instance, right, as early as 59 or 60, the Greensboro boys, right, 4 college boys, African Americans, went into a Woolworth's lunch restaurant and sat at the counter for whites only, asking for food and drink, right? And the first day, they had milkshakes poured over their head. They were spit upon, all kinds of expletives given to them, right? But then by the second or third day of doing it, they had a group of white and black Southerners who were coming in or staying around the windows of the establishment, chanting for them, supporting them. Supposedly, a Southern white woman came and kissed one of them on the head and said, "It's about time you boys did this."
That would have been me. I'm such a softie. I can't even watch movies like that without crying. And so just, I don't know. I just don't understand how people can be so cold and hateful and just
And ugly, right? I'll tell you what, Paulie, I'm glad you mentioned that because that encapsulates, right, the idea of nonviolent civil disobedience is the fact, right, that you are literally to shame, right? You are to shame your oppressor and you are to shame the public, not so much shame the public, you're to shame your oppressor and you are to elicit the compassion and the sympathy of the public at large, right? So they
yeah.
said, okay, it is imperative when you go and because right, that whole idea, right, is you believe that man-made civic laws sometimes don't get it right and are not in line with a natural higher law, right, of humanity. And that
Right.
natural higher law, right, is that all people ought to be treated, I think of the golden rule of Jesus, right? Treat other people as you'd want to be treated yourself. And so obviously the golden rule was being violated in Jim Crow South. And so you go and you protest one of those civil laws by defying it, but you do it very meekly, right? Because
Yeah.
you're trying to win over not just the public around you, you're trying to win over the very people that are mistreating you and in charge
Right. So
of those.
showing that compassion, that like kissing them on the forehead and saying it's about time, is not a way to attack those people that are against it, but to show compassion and as an example.
That's right. That's right. And so absolutely, right? And so you're to win their hearts. You're to win their hearts and minds. And I'll tell you what, Paulie, you saying that, right? I think of I I humbly I don't even know if I suggest it because yeah, you might I know it'll move you to tears. So it's up
I'm
to you.
already
But
tearing.
I want to at least mention it, okay?
Yeah.
Is simply go to YouTube
Uh
and
huh.
simply put in Birmingham footage.
Oh God.
Oh
Okay.
my gosh, man. I'm not a crier and I can't tell you how much that moves me. It
Was
is
the one with the
unbelievable.
fire hose? Like there
Yes.
were fire hose. Yes, I think I posted something like that during BLM under quarantine
Uh-huh.
and got backlash for it. And I actually removed it because I succumbed to the hatred that I was getting for posting it.
Oh wow.
I just couldn't believe it. I was in shock, and I just wanted to kind of put it out there because I thought people would feel how I felt, and I was very sadly surprised that a small amount of people didn't feel what I felt, and I was just
Yes.
dumbfounded. And I just deleted it and moved forward with my life, what I was doing, but. I
No,
didn't want
good
it
for
to be.
you.
I didn't want to be a platform for arguing at the time, you know.
Yeah, good for you,
But
Polly.
I did see that, and my heart was broken.
Polly, I totally second that. I completely agree with you. And it makes me sick to my stomach that people are judged by the color of their skin because we are all the same on the inside. And I just think it's sickening.
It just
And I'm hoping, I hope that our generation is one who changes, whose opinions are different, and that we start treating people more equally. But I don't know, with the way culture is right now, I don't even know if our generation is going to be one that can change this.
Well,
I
until
mean,
we learn from history,
you know,
right?
the the whole this whole, black versus white, or, cultures against each other is so ingrained in our society
Yeah.
that I would hope that we would be the ones to change it, but I don't know.
Well, we're
I,
already setting bad examples with
yes,
attacks on Asians now, and it's just
yes,
I can't even watch TV anymore, Professor. That's all I gotta say. I
yes,
just
Yeah.
can't.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that too, Paulie, and both of you. Thank you for that. Um, but I think of also, right, like the role of the press, right? Is Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and other adherents to this philosophy and this MO of trying to bring
Yeah,
about civil rights, right, accomplishments. They they were aware. They kind of predicted that it was going to be polarizing. That but they had faith, right, that the half that will be moved to compassion,
uh-huh.
the half, the segment that would be moved to indignation, right, to righteous anger, would be greater. Just if no other reason, they'd be greater numerically, right? But such was their faith in humanity, would be greater numerically than the other half. And what I mean by the other half, right, is they were well aware of the fact of they kind of use Freudian science, etc. Right? And again, I can only dabble my toes into that
No, you got
water.
it. Yeah,
But the idea, right, is that it people will go to great subconscious and conscious levels to try to obviate their sense of guilt and shame. That it's
yeah,
amazing
it is.
how clever, how devious
Your mind got
our own
imprinted.
human brain is and can
Yeah,
be, right? And
hmm,
trying to stay away from feeling ashamed.
yeah, that's so true. It becomes like just like making your bed. It's the way that you think. It just naturally, and until you're self-aware, just like the hierarchy, like you mentioned, it works the same way where people get to that level where they can look around and say, hey, I shouldn't be treated like this. Those people who are already at that level should be looking around and being more self-aware and saying, hey, I need to start treating people better at the
Right.
same time.
Right. And
I
absolutely right. And also remember, because the whole idea of institutional racism, right? It connotes that it's larger than any individuals, right? It's embedded in our institutions, our schools, our families, our government at every level, right, etc. So that it's less inclined to point fingers toward or people are less inclined to want to take responsibility for that injustice, right? And
Yeah,
saying, hey, well, I'm not bad personally. I don't treat them bad personally. And so
yeah,
hence, you see, Floyd, right? Saying 8 minutes on his stomach, just powerless and saying, I can't breathe, right? It's like you have that segment of society that says, get that away from me. I don't want to see it. I'm not Derek Chauvin. I didn't do that. I wanted no part of that. And I don't want to see that. I don't want to be confronted by that. I want to believe that it's anomalous and not normal. And so you have all kinds of levels, right? And I give anything if I had uh, also majored or gone back to school for psychology alone. To me, I'm so fascinated by that
well, this
field.
is an interesting cross between them, and because for my studies, I only took one sociology class, so it didn't really mesh the way that you're meshing it now with history, which I've been falling in love with. So this is awesome.
Oh, good, good.
But
And
I have one more question. When you were
yeah.
talking about like that lady that did the voters things, what was her last name? Nash or
Oh, Beverly Nash. Oh, wait, is it Beverly or Diane Nash? Oh,
Diane
shame,
Nash?
shame
Okay,
on me. It's Diane Nash. I'm
so you
sorry.
said Diane. I thought the first time. I think I might have said it.
Yeah,
And
no, I said it. I'm sorry.
when you're moving on to like the great men and women, I have that part where Rosa Parks was on the bus, wasn't it? I know you got to
Oh,
help
yeah,
me. So when you talk about, because we were just talking about news media or the news,
sure.
reporting and stuff like that, since they really didn't have that back then. There was also a woman that came to mind that, during that time, I think her last name was, oh God, Robinson. And after that incident, she distributed, like, I don't know, something like 100,000 flyers personally to people to make them aware of the situation, so that it became so that people were aware of it.
Good for
That
her.
one person.
Yeah,
So
I
explain to me.
apologize. That name should ring a bell to me, and it's not at this moment.
No,
I'm
that's
sorry.
okay. It was just because we were talking about how we were talking about what were we talking about, media or news?
Yeah, we were right. We were
Yeah,
talking about how the leaders of those practicing nonviolent civil disobedience, right,
yeah,
knew
yeah,
that it would have a polarizing effect. That they were hoping the majority of white Americans, let's say, right, of Americans in
yeah.
general, will become empathetic, will
Right.
weep, right, when they see this stuff and hear about it. That
Yeah.
they'll become indignant and demand a change, etc. Right, but they were aware that a pretty significant segment would recoil from it, right? Like, get
Mhm.
that out of my face. I don't want to see that. That's ugly. I
Right.
don't want to feel that sense of shame. I want to separate myself from any type of responsibility for that wrongdoing because I myself didn't do it, right? Um, and then in that second group, that latter group, right? I think that you'll find a common quote where they find the press to be agitating, right? That the press is provoking, it's agitating, and then
Right.
it's they resent the press, right, for being divisive.
Mhm.
Whereas the former group, right, they almost thank the press because they believe it's bringing it to everyone's attention, so that
Mhm.
it will elicit, popular sympathy and indignation that will, in and of itself, trigger a demand for change.
Right. And this lady, this Joanne Robinson, her sense of justice, I'm reading this just from a paper I had, and her
Sure.
belief in nonviolent protests is what propelled the civil rights movement forward and changed the course of history. So it was her actions to get that out and that awareness that we're talking about. So I just thought that would something nice to add to great men and women.
Of course. No, absolutely. Um, we could morph into that very soon, but I wanted to, if you don't mind, if we could do one more in between,
No.
and that is right,
Oh,
is what do you think, if you've had the chance to read? I tried to incorporate a thought-provoking thesis that it kind of as a refutation, right, or addendum to the one that praises nonviolent civil disobedience. So, by the way, you have one early on, right, that does just that. Look for that in one of the first sections where it says, gains made in the courts were great. They were wonderful. They did their part, but they were never sufficient. I think an interesting book that makes that argument time and time again, and of course the author makes exceptions in which, the where court cases had an immediate, successful, effective effect. But by and large, oftentimes this book contends they did not. And that is From Jim Crow to Civil Rights, the Supreme Court and the Struggle for Racial Equality by Michael Klarman. This is a very interesting book on that subject, okay? And so, for instance, he contends you have to worry how well a decision made by a judge, right, in a court is going to carry out change for the better depends upon things like the lobbyist power of those who are fighting for that change, right? How strong it is and numerically large, the popularity of the decision, right? The strength of the verdict's opposition, enforcement mechanisms once the decision has been made. Are there loopholes, right, with the writings of the rationale, the reasons for the decision? People have been ingenious historically, especially in American history, of getting around those loopholes. I mean, after all, right, the Jim Crow laws were loopholes. There was administration laws and amendments made at the end of the Civil War that prohibited discrimination, right? But they always found ways to get around it, to circumvent it. Literacy tests, grandfather clauses, So one by one, these were challenged and eventually overturned in the courts. But the argument was made early on in this assignment that that was wonderful, but it wasn't enough. That the public needed to see, they needed that agitation, that confrontation that was carried out by the nonviolent civil disobedience groups like CORE and SNCC and SCLC, right? And so, and not to mention with the Mexican Americans like Mayo. And so, at any rate, you, and by the way, I'm going to save a question for next week on women. Okay. There's just so much in this. I hope you don't mind. I decided to separate women from this topic and just focus upon largely African American and some Latino movement, Chicano movement stuff. So at any rate, where was I going with this? So that's an early thesis, right? Is that people needed to be shamed into it. They needed to see this stuff on television, like I mentioned with the Birmingham footage. They needed to be shamed into compliance, moved to indignation, pressured, right, etc. Then I have another one that says, well, that still wasn't far enough. That in trying to elicit the shame and the empathy of white America, if you will, that Martin Luther King and others, right, were unnecessarily succumbing or volunteering to martyrdom. And of course, that's a whole other topic in and of itself, right? Like you see, that's a big topic in like early Christianity. To what extent, right, does martyrdom work as an effective tool for bringing about change? And of course, in Christian historiography, it's praised, right? Turn the other cheek. There was a quote from a man named Tertullian who said, the blood of the martyrs is seed, right? For the church, from which the church can grow. And you look, evidently numbers, ironically, climbed during the great persecutions of Rome, etc., amongst converts, etc., right? That it was winning people's hearts and minds over, their dedication and so forth. But I have another number that challenges that, right? And says that will only work, take it at the micro level, right? With your own life. That if you have a child, right, who's being bullied, and let's say you say, okay, you think of the ideal thing for your kid to do or say that involves, right, shaming, turning the other cheek, but going a step further and trying to actually shame that bully at school, right? And statistically, it seems like absolutely with some bullies, it will work where you hear or you experience those cases, right, where the bully uncharacteristically just becomes silent or just turns red with embarrassment. And it's as if that person, that bully, the person engaging in the bully behavior has had like an epiphany, like, wow, maybe I'm the jerk, maybe I'm playing the bad guy here, right? And then of course, there are times and instances in which we experience or observe where that doesn't do anything, where the bully says, oh, right on, you turn the other cheek, continue to turn it, and I'll slap your cheek every time you do it. And that they perceive kindness as weakness, and they like to prey on weakness and so forth, right? And please remember, I'm trying to be thought provocative. Feel free to disagree with this. I'm not even contending that this is what I believe. I just have read this thesis and I thought it was interesting. And so I thought it was worth putting in there for discourse between us. And so with this subsequent number, it's saying, okay, great. The nonviolent civil disobedient movement was limitedly effective. It was, all right? But it didn't touch everyone's hearts and minds. It didn't bring about a change in all of America. That you also needed that demographic, right? That scared white America into wanting change. And there's one piece of data that I find very fascinating is I'm reading a book right now on Alan Brinkley, by the way, mentions this as well in our textbook. But The Pursuit of Fairness, A History of Affirmative Action by Terry H. Anderson. Okay. I'm reading this book and he gives direct quotes, right, of affirmative action policies being implemented, right, uh, by the very words of Lyndon B. Johnson and others, because of their fear of black violence, saying basically something needs to be done before we have a revolution. If you'll indulge me, page 105, it says, in 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson invited 15 titans of industry to the White House, telling them, right, that he would subsidize them and reward them, right, economically, if they were to provide on the job training for African American men to try to get the black boys out of the quote ghettos and into the factories to work, right? And literally it says LBJ pledged federal funds. Let's see here. This is a direct quote. You can put these people to work and you won't have a revolution because they've been left behind. If they're working, they won't be throwing bombs in your homes and plants. Keep them busy and they won't have time to burn your cars. Wow, right?
Oh my God.
Yeah, no joke.
That
That
pisses me
is,
off. Excuse me.
yes, that is such a paradox, right? Is you find some downright racist quotes, right? And evidence that might suggest that Lyndon B. Johnson's heart was not in the right place by the very president who pushed the Civil Rights Acts into passing. How
Or he
ironic is
was
that?
trying to, or he was making a play on the people who believed that.
Okay, good. That is a very valid possibility for sure. But like I said, to be honest, not to crack down too harshly on President Johnson, but you could find quotes of this nature in several different contexts to several different parties. To
Yeah,
be
I
honest,
give it away.
and yeah, it's like wow, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you even have people with a thesis that LBJ was so competitive and so jealous regarding Kennedy that he was trying to out Kennedy by bringing forth this legislation. You have people contend that showing evidence that he kept a on his person evidence of how much legislation had passed during his tenure, and he would ask his secretary, "Do you think my mother would be proud?" And so you have the element of vanity and pride that was involved. He oftentimes appealed to Southern senators and congressmen, right? Telling them, giving them the sense of destiny, saying, we're going to be known in the history books as the administration that finally carried this out. And it's inevitable. It's going to happen, he said. It might as well be through us, and we'll be famous for it. It's crazy.
You know, I don't want to talk bad about any presidents, but I feel like a lot of our politics, just with this current president, really put in the forefront the fact that he was hiring, you know, the first, I think it was transgender person, or I'm not sure because I try not to listen too much because I get so angry, but all
Yeah,
these people he put in office, they weren't describing how qualified they were. They were describing the fact that they were a minority up until this point and that he put them there and he was the first one to do it. It was almost like his reasoning was for something different.
yes. Yeah, and then you have the question, right? Do motives matter? Is there a long-term consequence of doing things by way of the wrong motives, right? And some argue yes, some argue no. So
Religiously, you do.
yeah, oh, absolutely. I think when you get into the realm of ethics and religion,
Yeah.
I think that's a much easier question to answer.
But
But
maybe
like
he had good
historically,
heart.
right? When you
Maybe.
just pragmatically look at it, right? Without ethics and just look at just practical results. I'm not saying it requires a different answer. I'm just saying it seems to be a little bit more messy, right? When you look at it more amorally. Um, but at any rate, right? Like for instance, if you were to ask, you know, Huey Newton of the Black Panthers, do you want to win over white America? Does it bother you that LBJ and some Southern congressmen are passing civil rights legislation for the wrong reasons, right? And I think you could arguably make the contention that he would say, yes, personally it bothers me. It's at the heart of why I'm doing what I'm doing, but I have no hope for the contrary. conceded to that reality, right?
Right.
That he thought of African Americans as literally a colonized people. He likened African Americans to literally like a separate country, right? And white America were like an invading army that came and occupied the black neighborhoods. That instead of tanks, they had police cars, right? So he literally made that metaphor. And so to him and others, right, they might argue, hey, we'll take what we can get. I think of Malcolm X, right, in the separatism of the Nation of Islam under Elijah Muhammad there in Detroit, as they contended, right, hey, uh, we have no hope of integration. The white men do not want to intermarry with us, or anything even remotely tantamount to social integration, and even political integration. They're doing it for the wrong reasons, and it won't be thorough. So hence, let's just go back to Africa. Let's go somewhere else. Have them pay us and subsidize us what they owe us for our ancestry of slavery, and we'll be out, right? And so with Malcolm X and others like Huey Newton, right? They looked at Martin Luther King, and I'll never forget an old movie, and I've never come across this quote directly. So I think it was artistic license, and I'm not sure that I don't think it was a real quote, but I thought it was so telling from everything else I've read about Malcolm X and about what Malcolm X wrote of and spoke of concerning Martin Luther King and the nonviolent civil disobedience movement. Is in this old like 80s movie on Martin Luther King, the character of Malcolm X meets him, and when they part from each other, he grins and he shakes his head and he says, rather warmly, rather endearingly, but he says, "What a glorious fool." And I thought that has always stuck with me, just that quote. And so at any rate, right? I mean, you could look up, they have a kind of, it's not very professionally done, but you could put in on YouTube Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King, and it just
I
look at,
remember who played him in that movie. It was the oh gosh, he was in so many. Do you remember who played him?
I don't, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's been so
It's
long,
irrelevant, but I
but
saw the same
but yeah,
thing.
all the more reason, right? I couldn't even tell you a single actor from that movie in all this time, but
Denzel
I
Washington.
but I remember that precise quote.
I
Uh,
do too. It was Denzel Washington
Okay,
that said
yeah,
it.
that's such a poignant thing, that's such a poignant point. Like, wow. And like I said, just you could look up Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King, and look at some of the speeches by Malcolm X. And I'll tell you what, agree or disagree with Malcolm X, admire or resent Malcolm X, I can almost guarantee you he will keep your attention. There was something charismatic, magnetic, so strong about his stance, his bearing, but not just strong. I would also say dignified. He gave a sense of dignity to young African Americans, right?
Who could you compare him to today, if you could, off the top of your head?
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
Anyone that sticks out, not for the same reasons, but with that kind of magnetism that can get people to follow and listen and just be.
Well, I think as far as his demeanor and somewhat cynicism about being accepted or integrated, because by all means their ideology is different. Okay,
Right.
I want to qualify that.
Right.
But just in those categories alone, I think of Al Sharpton.
I don't even know who that is. Oh my
Yeah,
god.
yeah, you can look up Al Sharpton. But
Okay.
but again, like I said, I think nothing against Al Sharpton, but to me there was an even greater degree of charisma and
Yeah.
and self-respect, etc. that Malcolm X carried with him that I don't even think Al Sharpton touches.
I think those things are just inherent. They're based. I mean, it just takes an incredible person to be at that
Yeah.
level.
So please, okay, all of you, please consider that, okay, at any given downtime that you have in your life, look at a speech by Malcolm X. It's fascinating. Like I said, it will keep your attention. He was something else. And as it says in the book, right, it's unfair to just contend that Malcolm X was for violence. No, right? What he contended is that not all Americans can be shamed by Martin Luther King and SNCC's approach, and that group needs to be made afraid of messing with Black people. And they need to know that Black people are arming themselves and willing to protect themselves, right? If need be, violently, if and when they are first attacked by white men.
That's a big,
That's a big distinction, you know?
yeah, that's a big misconception, I think, for a lot of people who weren't educated on that, you know, theme, or that, what's the word I'm looking for? You know what I'm saying?
No, no, absolutely. Just on that phenomenon, right? Or
Yeah,
um,
yes.
and so, for instance, another thing that you could look into if you were interested, look up on Freedom Summer, look at some of the SNCC members when they were living in camps, because they got to such numbers that they couldn't just be, taken in by volunteers that would take them into their house.
My
The-
question is, weren't they freedom riders? Is that
oh,
something different?
yeah, that was core, and they had freedom rides back in I think 61, and
Oh,
not a single bus made it to its destination. They went through the
oh
Jim Crow
wow.
South, and they had black and white sitting side by side, and in some cases, black people sitting in the front and white people in the back, as a symbol, right? As a symbolic gesture going through the South. And
Wow.
oh my goodness, you look into that, that is a very sad episode.
Yeah.
You'll feel a great sense of pride in them, but sadness as far as the results.
Oh,
Yeah, that was core. Um, um, Bayard Rustin, Jim Farmer, Jim Peck. Look up some of those names. Very
okay.
interesting individuals. But again, going back to the Freedom Summer, right? Is you had some, and I find this so fascinating. And by the way, this is in just a standard book, like Branch's book, Pillar of Fire by Taylor Branch. Okay, I had to look back at my bookshelf to remember the name. But Taylor Branch is a big, popular writer on the civil rights, and in this book, right, it contends that there were some. I'm almost positive it's this book. I apologize if it's another one and I'm mistaken. But it contends that some of the young Black men, in particular, right, who had moved their families down there to register voters and all that, right, that during the day they were turning the other cheek when they went on marches, when they did whatever it is they were doing, nonviolent civil disobedience, doing their famous sit-ins. Right? Remember, you'd go into a white company's business place and began singing hymns or ask for service, knowing you were not going to receive it until you were oftentimes arrested, beaten up, or both. And so, at any rate, they were willing to incur that and turn the other cheek during the day, but when they went back home at night and the local KKK and other members came and attacked their home where their host was keeping them, or their cars where they were sleeping in the camp, right? Then they began reporting to people like Stokely Carmichael saying, hey, man, I'm okay with endangering my own life during the day, but I'm not going to sit by and let the KKK kill my child or my wife, right? And so they faced that moral dilemma regarding, almost a willingness to be martyred versus an inherent, feeling of necessity to protect themselves and their loved ones. And I just find that topic so fascinating. And look at Stokely Carmichael himself, the leader of these nonviolent civil disobedient movements. He has a famous picture, right, where a German Shepherd is attacking him and he's got his hands up and it's attacking his midsection. And then you also later on, he begins pushing for the Black Power movement and contending that African Americans need to separate even from well-intentioned white liberal civil rights movement volunteers. They need to stay apart, right? And they need to, even if violently need be, protect themselves. So his evolution is fascinating. That topic to me is fascinating. All right. And so then in addition to that, we also have two more topics I want to try to get through here. We're going to go forever. And I apologize. We're already going long enough, you guys, that those of you who are still here at the end, I'm going to give 10 points instead of just 5. You've earned it.
I'm sorry, that's me chiming
No,
in.
it's okay. You're enriching it. I promise, Polly. I'm not just saying that. You are. So great man and great woman history, just what it implies, right? Is what if you didn't have key individuals that tirelessly worked, right? Uh, for a certain cause, etc. So you mentioned Rosa Parks, right? Her incident absolutely was incendiary. It set off a trail of events. It set off organizations being developed, events being planned, right? What if that had not happened and she had not taken that stance and refused to give up her seat for a white man, right? Uh, I think of also Cesar Chavez. This guy, right? I love his autobiography. He's so humble and saying, I'm nothing special. I'm not especially intelligent. I'm not especially charismatic. But he admits that he was a tireless worker. And so and by the way, he was the first to contend that if he didn't have help, right, that he would have been in big trouble. That it was absolutely necessary to have help. But I tell you what, I mean, I don't have time to get into the details, but you could look up his autobiography and look at the way that he organized migrant farm workers, right, in their entire communities, and not just to walk off and strike, right, not just a boycott at the grocery stores, the grapes and other fruits that were being made by scab workers in their place, right? And by bosses that growers that refuse to give them basic minimum wages and health and sanitation, uh, you know, um, uh, variables. I can't think of the word I'm thinking of, but at any rate, like I said, I think you can make the argument that Cesar Chavez was very instrumental in the migrant, the farmer migrant farmer uh, industry, and forcing the growers to to come to terms with them. Let me give you just one example, if you don't mind. When growers denied to the press and denied to the government that they were doing certain things as far as their treatment and payment, he sent spies to go work, uh, uh, claiming that they couldn't speak English, that they were immigrants, etc. Right? And they came in and got information that he needed. And he would tell them, "Hey, I hate to blackmail you, but you put me in this position. I'm either going forth to the press and to the government with this information, or you could just quietly come to terms with me." So I tell you what, that they're reading his autobiography. Uh, a lot of people came to realize that they should not have underestimated this humble man. He had a warrior spirit inside him. Um, and like I
My
said,
father-in-law, when my in-laws came over here, my
yeah,
father-in-law was just telling us the other day that he worked in the fields. They're Mexican. He worked in the fields, and he said that he got paid 85 cents an hour.
wow, I believe it.
I just
I
thought
believe
that
it.
was just crazy.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
you see, right? I remember it was written in Spanish for a while, just up the road toward Lodi, where there was a sign, right, that said in Spanish, what was it, water and shade? It's the law. And so, there's an awareness now that there's a lot has been done. And of
Yeah.
course, you had that famous case of a young pregnant worker dying of a heat stroke. That was just a couple years ago.
And what was it? What were they called? The people that we asked to bring over here. That you would know this from history. I forgot what we termed them, but from
Braceros.
Yeah,
her,
the braceros.
the braceros. Yes, if I don't
Yesenia,
know
I'm sorry.
if she knows about those, but if that's what her family was talking about. But yeah, that same thing. And then even when they sent them home, they still owed them and didn't pay them.
That's right.
And
Yesenia,
they
do you
went around collecting them in trucks to take them back when we were done. It's just crazy.
It is. It is. If you don't mind me picking on you, Yesenia, do you have anything to add, hun, on that topic with the braceros?
Mm, not really. Just like what I know, because of family members have mentioned to us that that's something that was a common job. That was an
Yeah.
easy job, and it was like kind of like a given job to these Mexican workers.
Uh huh.
And it was easier for them to get up, come work, and it was like um, an opportunity for them. with and they, a lot of them were able to gain citizenship for their children due to having the capability of coming in and out to work.
Really?
Um,
You know what? Sadly, I've read
Oh,
up on the breast settle program and I was not
I
aware of
didn't know
that.
that
That's good to
either.
know.
Yeah.
but, yeah, because a lot of their children were born while they were out here working due to
Interesting.
the fact that they were in the like California or wherever they were working, their children were born in California, so they became citizens. So the irony is that they were able to um, gain from that. Their
And were
children.
their families allowed to
Mhm.
stay with them?
Yeah, and a lot of them did. A lot of them, a
Good.
lot of those children became, like you mentioned, educated, and a lot of
Good.
them went back home and just. But it's not as popular anymore. That's something I do know.
No, that's fascinating. And I'm glad, see, I'm so glad I picked on you, Yesenia. I learned something that I wasn't aware of.
I am
That's
too
fascinating.
because, and I mean, you can kick me for saying this, but I don't know where it came from. But sometimes in my life, I've had some sort of like that where I push that away, and it almost made me feel like I was prejudiced. And when I learned that story, it was the very first course I took coming back to school in college study skills. We watched a movie, and it just completely opened my eyes and changed the way I felt and how I was more self-aware about what discrimination I had embedded in me, and I'm trying to find out where it came from, even though I didn't really feel that way on the outside. And it really opened my eyes and changed a lot for me. And I have so much more respect for people now. And it was just, I'm gonna cry, but it was a huge moment. So it was
No,
nice to hear that something good came from that.
and Polly, good for you. You're just simply being more honest than most people would be. That's it's that simple. That's wonderful. I have no doubt that so many people that are from a comfortable working class, comfortable middle class, white collar background, especially WASP and not immersed in Hispanic culture, they were to spend a day out in the fields. It would be very moving, and at first it would probably be very uncomfortable because even though there's something inherent, right? Like that term again, institutional racism. Even though you were not personally responsible and had no hand in anything to do with that system of exploitation, right?
Yeah.
You're still standing amongst them, and no, absolutely. I was able to touch that a little bit. I went to a couple Spanish speaking countries. I double majored in Spanish as well,
Oh,
and I had some productively uncomfortable moments that I wouldn't trade for anything. So at any rate, I need to kind of sum this up, okay? Or I need to end this soon. I have personal things I got to go tend to with my son. But also note the only other thing we haven't mentioned are the last ones, right? And that is reform from above with the Johnson administration. So it stated that discrimination, right? And I don't have it on here, but they specified in the 1964 Civil Rights Act discrimination at the workplace, right? Discrimination in public and or private businesses, and discrimination. What else am I missing? In education, public or private, is now prohibited, right, upon race, color, religion, sex, national origin. And then they added the latter two, sexual orientation and gender identity, starting in the 90s, much later. So at any rate, right, what's fascinating is when you look at Article 7 on no discrimination based upon color. I cannot emphasize this book enough. It's so interesting. I'm in the middle of it right now. But at any rate, he begins by, he finds himself in a conundrum where it says, you shall not, right, discriminate based upon color or quote race, right? But then he looks, and there are a couple things that just gnaw at his administration, right? And not to mention, by the way, guys, that whole thesis about it required that contingent of the movement that scared white America into action. He has direct quotes again with Article 7, where he very often quoted the riots in Watts in Detroit, etc., right? And that something needs to be done to put these young black men to work so that they're not angry. So at any rate, when he looks, right, they look at a couple things. As one is proportionality. They look and say they generally have an idea that, okay, well, it's a problem, right? If there are, 25% African Americans in the city, and then this company, right, or school or whatever, has an enlistment of only 3% of its students, 3% of its employees are African American. Yet they constitute, right, in the society around them, 25% of the population. So to them, right, they don't like things being out of proportion, right, as far as representation. And then also what they discover, or what they kind of conclude, is they're looking for results. So for instance, you look at different businesses, and they are very matter of fact and merit based, whereby they say, we're looking for someone who can pass our electrical skills test. There is a physical test, right, in which we try to get you to diffuse something or set something up. And then there is an academic test. You sit down at a desk and answer questions, right, about electricity, etc. And you also have to have a GED, right, etc. And so if you don't meet those three criteria, right, or don't do well on those two tests, then they don't hire you. But de facto, who by and large keeps passing those tests with GEDs, etc., right? Primarily white young men. So they look at results and they say, well, there's no evidence of any kind of, of an intention to discriminate. But nevertheless, the result is the same, is that African Americans are just not making the cut for this employer. So he makes the very controversial decision and says, we're going to, by use of the carrot and the stick, right, rewards and punishment, we're going to try to induce all businesses and schools to try to bring about a quota system, basically, right? And it evolved because LBJ didn't know what he even wanted, much less what he was doing when he began this. And not to mention, from the very get-go, when Article 7 was discussed in Congress, there were, when it passed, that was one thing, saying there'd be no discrimination based upon race, color, right? But then when they started implementing the EEOC, right, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the EEOC representative came to a Senate committee and told him he was tinkering with the idea of quotas. Oh my goodness, it got an uproar in response, right? And they said, well, no, you're contradicting yourself. You're saying that you shall not discriminate, right? You shall not treat someone in a special way, good or bad, based upon his or her color, right? But that's exactly what you're doing. You're giving jobs to African Americans because of their color and not by merit, not by them earning it. And so this, from the very get-go, from the tops of government, brought about a big white backlash, right? And contending, as you've heard, the contention that this is, quote, reverse discrimination. But he looks, right, and he gives a famous quote at Howard University. Okay. And there he says, you know what? Just opening up and saying that there shall not be discrimination is not enough. It's not sufficient. That African Americans in particular, he said, are in a special category whereby they have been marginalized and exploited for so long that there has become a culture, a marginalized culture of poverty, right? Whereby, and he had stats. There was a famous report, matter of fact, that had stats on this. There were a couple reports that became famous in pushing for this, right? Give me a moment. One is known as the Kerner Report, Kerner, named after Otto Kerner, the governor of Illinois, who wrote a report for him. That was, by the way, connecting riots and violence to Article 7 and saying that quotas need to be made so that it keeps the young black men from becoming angry and engaging in violence. And then another one, what's the other name? And that's the one, of course, the one I can't find is the one I'm looking for. You know what? It's Moynihan, Patrick Moynihan, Moynihan. And his report was known as the Negro, that was the lexicon of that day, the Negro Family, the Case for National Action. And he gets into stats about illegitimate births, the absence of a father, and divorces and separation, unemployment, right? criminal records, child delinquency, malnourishment, longevity, right? And shows how African Americans, especially in the poor urbanized areas, are absolutely marginalized, and they're stuck in this cycle of hopelessness and despair, right? And trying to cope with what they seem to be a hopeless life and situation. So at any rate, he says they need special help. So that at that point, after his speech at Howard University, he became less apologetic and more bold in his decision to implement what would be later known as a quota system, right, or affirmative action. And so the carrot and the stick. What he would do is he had easy ties to uh, companies that had contracts with government, right? That was easy because they're being, you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you, right? You're getting enriched from your contract with the government. So he had no qualms constitutionally or personally by saying, I'll withhold funds, right? If you're in any way contingent upon the national government, right, for funds, and we have the right with our EEOC, right, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, to investigate and also receive letters and grievances, right? And if we investigate and find that's the case, we're going to retract our funds from you, right? And then secondly, what they can do is they can hand it over to the Justice Department and it be taken to court, and they will fight on behalf of those aggrieved, right? Contending that they didn't get the job, they didn't get accepted into the school, etc., because of their black skin, right? So those were some common sticks that were used. Another one later on, I'm just learning about it, and I apologize, but in some cases, the government would order cease and desist issues to the businesses. So there was a big stick that the government now had in its hand to try to enforce this use of quotas in proportion to the local population. Okay. And again, remember, it was about results. Uh, so it wasn't just about overtly saying African Americans can't have this job, right? No one was that stupid to do that at that point after the civil rights movement. But so even with their standard tests, they had to change something to ensure that they had a certain proportion of African Americans, women, etc. I find this topic to be fascinating as well. And so, at any rate, the carrot, of course, also was money. You could be subsidized and receive government contracts, etc. Right? If you cooperate, especially if you preemptively take the first step and notify the government that you had plans, like Chrysler did and a couple other big corporations. And the government, LBJ's government, very generously compensated Chrysler and Coca-Cola as well for cooperating and volunteering, right? But again, that sense of the government really having a command over private businesses, people questioned the constitutionality of it. They contended that this was reverse discrimination, and an irony that they were treating people according to the color of their skin. To me, it's just fascinating. What I find also interesting is Martin Luther King Jr. privately asked, right, about affirmative action in this book, has a direct quote from him saying yes, saying that African Americans have a unique history and there should be an element of compensation to allow us as African Americans to play catch up, if you will, right? But he and the two leaders of CORE both contended that the program shouldn't last more than about 10 years, that it should be like the Marshall Plan in Europe, where the money is put into an altruistic endeavor to help build certain demographics up, but it's finite, right? A finite amount of money for a finite amount of time. But by the way, Martin Luther King is going to, such was the controversy, right, of this policy, that later on, when the press put him to task about his private support for it, he wouldn't publicly take the stand because he was afraid of alienating his large white uh, contingency of supporters, right? Because he won over a lot of white Americans, arguably, by certain, barometers, measuring sticks to look at. And so he knew that a lot of white Americans resented this, right? And so he kind of backstepped a little bit and said, well, I think there needs to be help, right? Like New Deal type help, giving purchasing power and ensuring, opportunities of getting a job, of getting into school. But he says it should be based on economics and it should be colorblind and not just for Black people or just for women, etc. But that it should be economically decided. And that's the direction that Section 8 went, right? With the housing administration, whereby they would contend, they would look at your salary under LBJ's government, right? See how much you could afford a month for rent, and the government would foot the rest of the bill. And it was based upon your income and not color. But a lot of other things like affirmative action and other things, right, were directed unapologetically to African Americans, contending that they alone had had a uniquely awful, marginalized experience in American history, and that they needed and deserved that extra help, that extra boost, if you will. And so this is going to create eventually, right? LBJ has a quote where he just contended, right? Uh, he tells one of his presidential aides, "I think we've just lost the South to the Republican Party," and he was right. The Democratic Party is largely, or I mean, I'm sorry, the Southerners are largely going to leave the Democratic Party for these policies, right, and join the Republican Party. And how ironic, right? The Republican Party was the abolitionist party. That was the party for African Americans at its origin. So you're going to get the counter conservative revolution with Ronald Reagan, right? And contending that the liberal movement of the civil rights movement and liberalism itself had there was a time for it. It was necessary, but now it had gone on too far. It was too excessive, and you had a conservative counter revolution at the time of Reagan. Again,
When you say that about Lyndon B. Johnson, wasn't that who you were just talking about in the end before you stepped into Reagan? It was him, right?
yes, yes.
Yeah, it's just ironic with him too that the way we colored him, or not colored him, but gave him that that internal little bit of where he was afraid to do those things, but then when he finally did, he was right and he lost them.
Yeah, and and to really, it's easy to say, okay, this guy went for legislation because popular opinion was moving in that direction for something to be done for African Americans, right? He saw the good intentions, at least, of Kennedy, even though the civil rights legislation didn't pass through the Senate before he was killed. You could say that there was a degree of opportunism, but for him to take this step in helping out African Americans with what he knew was so unpopular with Southerners in particular, white America in particular, to me, that makes it a lot more complex trying to paint a portrait of this guy.
Of him. Yes, exactly. That was my point. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So other things, by the way, that are associated with him, and the idea, right, the conservative argument is that he took us away from meritocracy, of getting what you earn, right? And he started this culture of dependency, and it's a culture of entitlement, right? With certain demographics could just put a hand out and expect big government to just give them everything without working for a thing. So you have Medicaid, right? That there's no merit or payments paid into Medicaid as opposed to Medicare. To get medical insurance, that's free, right? You have food stamps. You had Head Start, right? Preschool and free lunches for kids, poor kids in school. And you have a sweet story of him being a substitute teacher in his 30s, making a vow to himself in a southern Mexican American town, and hearing the Mexican American boys' stomachs growl and having nothing to eat for lunch, that if he had the opportunity in the future, he'd do something about that. And so you have those. You have, like I said, Section 8, helping out, subsidizing homes. You have the affirmative action. You also had, with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, they're going to send out these groups of people that go into the ghettos and they declare urban blight, right? They demand that the government began issuing eminent domain directives toward dilapidated buildings, businesses that weren't employing really anybody. The government could force you to sell your company and property back to them, right? And move out of town. and then they would be subsidized by the federal government to make contracts with businesses and apartment complexes, etc., that would provide decent living standards and jobs in that local area for the poor people. I find that fascinating, the whole urban blight phenomenon. And they would have literally committees that would provide free job training and connections to employers. It did a lot, right? And it cost a lot of money. And we did get further into debt. But also, we had Vietnam going on at the same time. And people were like, we can't spend on both bread and butter, or I'm sorry, bread, butter, and guns. And so, at any rate, like I said, I wish I had more time, you guys. I don't. I need to go. But I hope this was helpful. I really, really genuinely enjoyed this today with you guys.
It was good today. Thank you.
Thank you for staying late with us. Go.
Yeah.
Go with your boy, your kids.
No, thank you. Make sure I have your names here, okay? Because you definitely have earned your 10 points today.
We had someone else here too that just left. Who was it? Oh gosh. There was one more person, you guys. Who was it? We had 6. Oh well.
Yeah, I had Aurelie Magana as well. So yeah.
Okay, that's it.
All right. So thank you, you guys. I genuinely enjoy you having you in class. You guys have a great week, okay?
Thanks so much, you too.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you. Appreciate it.